There's a principle in signal integrity that most designers know, but don't always think through when they're routing. The return current exists whether you designed it or not. You can route a perfect signal path, controlled impedance, match length, symmetric via structures for signal pairs, and still have a signal integrity problem because you didn't give the return current a good way to follow the signal when it changes layers. In an HDI board, every via, including micro via transition, is also a return current problem. Today we're going to look at what that actually looks like using the Sigrity X Aurora return path analysis workflow option. So here's the first thing to understand. At high frequencies and anything above a few hundred megahertz qualifies, the return current doesn't spread out across the ground plane looking for the lowest resistance path only. The return current flows and follows directly underneath the signal trace looking for a path of minimum impedance. Okay, minimum impedance. At higher frequencies, this is usually dominated by inductance. So you'll find that people say at low frequencies it's looking for minimum resistance, at high frequencies minimum inductance, but the rule is always minimum impedance. It's just one or the other may dominate, whether it's inductance, capacitance, or resistance. Now let's assume we're at higher frequencies and a higher megahertz, which is what we're looking at here. This is a return path vision. The return path follows directly underneath the signal trace. And these are the signal traces in question. Here, this is a negative part of a differential pair, and I ran a simulation on that to see its return path. If I start a simulation on the positive trace of this differential pair, we're going to see the return path results for that trace. And while that's running, the return path signal is trying to minimize the loop area between itself and the signal, which is why what we saw earlier, there was a return path signal going mostly underneath this negative trace, and you'll see a similar result for this positive one. It's easier to see when you turn that off, and we're going to view the layer 2 ground results. So here, this is the simulation results for the negative net. See that? Where it shows up on the layer 4 ground. And let's see what it looks like on a layer 2 ground. It looks like that. Notice how it followed that signal very closely underneath the trace. It didn't go everywhere on the PCB. So it's trying to minimize that loop area. When the signal changes layers through a via, the reference plane it was traveling along ends. So let's say the reference plane for this trace would be ground, right? This reference plane ends once the signal itself goes through, say, this via. And so the return current has to cross over to the reference plane in the new layer, as in layer 4. You see this? And if there's no stitching via right next to the signal via to give it a direct path, it has to take a detour. So let's say we want to look at another reference plane, layer 9 ground. The signal will have to take a detour. If we don't have a transition via, it will fan out along the plane looking for the nearest connection to the other reference, like reference layer 4 and layer 2. That detour creates a current loop that spreads out, and that current loop creates inductance. That inductance can introduce an impedance discontinuity that the signal feels at the via transition. And then I go ahead and run a current density analysis. Okay, ran the simulation off screen for the same board. You'll see that the currents will flow and they will find their own path around any voids or gaps where transitional vias are not present. Okay, they will find their own path no matter what. Now, this is a result of the electromagnetic field filling spaces and therefore inducing return currents through displacement current on adjacent paths and planes and routes. And notice how it avoids any gaps. So if you can place any return vias, it will greatly help the signal. When you saw the current flowing at the different transitions where the vias and antipads provided different choke points for the current to have to go around. That can happen because sometimes the return current or return path doesn't have a direct path to the new reference plane when you're transitioning with a via from layer to layer. That's what adds inductance to the via transition. When you're dealing with DDR5 signals, PCIe Gen 5. These transitions, even though they're very small vias, they all matter because they're not slow signals. We're talking about sub tens of picoseconds rise times. These rise times are fast enough that even a short detour in the return path can and most likely will show up as some sort of reflection in the signal path. So here we've got our ground stitching via and ground via in general. It's relatively close to this USB, this P1 USB DP signal, positive differential pair signal. The stitching via gives the return current a direct low inductance path from the reference plane. See, we're seeing the signal on layer 10, and the reference plane we have closest to it is layer 9 ground. So if we were to make this not visible, that's what layer 9 ground looks like. The return signal doesn't have to take a detour. The current loop stays very tight because you have that adjacent reference ground plane and a via that takes that signal to it. The inductance as well at the transition is dramatically lower than what you would get if you didn't have some way nearby for it to go to ground. The design principle is generally pretty explicit, okay? Every signal via transition should have an adjacent ground stitching via wherever possible, or at least close enough by. That's especially true for high-speed signals and in HDI boards. It's also true for dense BGA escape regions where you have dozens of via transitions like what you see in here, right? We want to have ground in between every single one of these signals, which is why engineers like Dan Beaker were critical in helping chip manufacturers change their packages so that ground pins could be in between each of these signal and voltage pins and pads. Also, there's the issue of via to via crosstalk. Okay, that's also partially a return path problem. When return currents are detouring, they interact with the adjacent signal return paths and generate crosstalk that wouldn't exist with proper stitching, right? So to explain what that means, if you didn't have the proper ground in between and via stitching in between with ground, then your return path current would be more spread out because the electromagnetic field is going to find a return path either way. If we're not guiding that, then your fields are going to spread out and then you're going to have your fields interacting with the other nearby pins, pads, and signals. And then that's where your crosstalk is going to start to happen. So we need some kind of return paths to help guide those fields and keep them away from our other signals. And the end result is that your return path stays mostly underneath your initial trace and your initial pads and signals. That would not exist without proper stitching or close enough adjacent return path vias. In Allegro X, stitching via constraints can be set to flag signal vias that don't have a reference via within a specified distance. So you can go into the constraint manager and then the return path under electrical. We look at these nets for routing and then flag different issues that we can come across for return path in the PCB. So if we look at this, you can run analysis and it'll let you know if you're missing a stitching via, okay? What amount of length of trace to ignore, the gaps in your pads, the stitching via distances, and then you can find out where that's coming from. And these can be set using different settings in your return path rule sets, like the stitching via distance, the length ignore, max pad gap, and any adjacent void spacings. Okay, so the point I'm trying to get across is that there are a lot of things to consider, whether it's a missing stitching vias and a signal return path. different gaps that are too wide or big that can cause issues for your return path signals. And the point is the return path exists whether you designed it or not. In an HDI design with hundreds of via transitions, every transition is an opportunity for a return path problem if an accompanying stitching via to your signal return plane isn't there. The consequence is that you get typically higher inductance at the transition, which, depending on how large that inductance difference is, shows up as an impedance discontinuity, which then shows up as a reflection, even if small, in your signal channel analysis. Your return path EMC problem then causes a signal integrity problem. This is not just a theoretical concern that you read in a textbook. It shows up as a measurable degradation in your I margin when you do the I diagram for your signals on your PCB. This kind of analysis is an example to see what's actually happening with your signals and return paths and verify that your stitching vias are doing their job.